So Dr. Liu's work has to do with new technologies that are more precise in their aim and, as you suggested, Dr. Engelman, more complex in their effect on cancer. Although the reference to Star Trek technology may seem whimsical, Dr. Liu's work takes deadly aim at cancer with the new technologies of flash phaser. Thanks for talking with us tonight, Dr. Liu.
All right, thank you so much for that very kind introduction and the opportunity to speak to all of you. Thank you all for the work that you do for our patients. I'm going to be talking about phaser and flash, and I'll explain in just a little bit what I mean by these very science fiction sounding words, and the radical approach to curing cancer worldwide. Now, I was told that this was supposed to be a TED-style talk, so I was a little concerned that maybe my title wouldn't be bold enough. But hopefully I'll try to convince you in the next 15 minutes or so that there's some substance to this and it's not all hyperbole. So I'd like to talk about the C word. And I think from the standpoint of patients, historically, the C word has been that word that they've been kind of afraid to say because it has such dire implications, and of course that's cancer, and that's that's the fear that we're trying to address for all of our patients. But from the standpoint of cancer clinicians and researchers, the word that we appear to have been somewhat afraid to say is the other C word, which is cure. And I think in part that's because in the past, we have overpromised a bit. We've had a somewhat naive idea that, maybe cancer could, the biological basis of cancer could be explained by kind of one universal phenomenon, and we could find the way to target that would cure cancer with a pill, and we have not delivered on that promise. And in fact, we realize more and more that may not be the right promise to deliver on. On the other hand, not to talk about cure, I think, does a disservice to our patients as well. And so I'll come back to that in just a moment. But I wanted to start by illustrating this with a patient. This is a patient that I saw who had locally advanced lung cancer, and it was in fact metastatic. So there was a large tumor invading into the lung and lymph nodes, and a metastasis to the adrenal gland. So this is stage 4 lung cancer, historically considered incurable. This is the same patient 10 years later with no evidence of the cancer cured. How was this patient cured? Was it a new anti-angiogenesis drug, or immunotherapy, or a molecularly targeted drug? Well, in fact, this patient was treated and cured with radiation therapy in combination with chemotherapy. And so I think one of the messages that I want to come across with here, and I think many people perhaps out in the world don't fully appreciate that radiation therapy is in fact one of the pillars of cancer therapy. And most of the time it's actually used with the intent to cure the cancer. Now, we're far from having the rate of success that we want to have, so a lot of work needs to be done. But many patients have the potential, at least, to be cured with radiation therapy, often in combination with other therapies. And in fact, radiation is used as part of the curative intent treatment for the most patients of any treatment modality. About 2/3 of patients in the United States are treated with radiation at some point in their treatment course, and around the world it's estimated that about half of patients with cancer would benefit from radiation therapy. Now, coming back to this patient, this is not a patient that historically we would think about taking a curative intent approach with. And I'll come back to that in a little bit, but in fact, because of advances in radiation therapy and because of the advances you've heard about tonight in many other domains, including personalized therapy, molecular targeted therapy, and immunotherapy, the role of radiation in being able to contribute to curative therapy is actually increasing with time because of advances in all of these areas. So that brings us to the question of what makes cancer incurable. And so, in fact, for every cancer treatment that we have, we're always balancing the ability to kill tumor cells against the collateral damage to normal organs. So the fundamental problem is not that we can't eradicate cancer cells. We can give enough chemotherapy to eradicate all cancer cells in the body. We can give enough radiation to eradicate all cancer cells. But the issue is that that's not a viable way to treat patients. So in fact, cancer really becomes incurable if the treatment needed to eliminate the cancer is not tolerable by the patient. And so it's always this balance that we refer to as therapeutic index, kind of creating that separation between tumor killing and reducing damage to normal tissues. And so for every cancer therapy, we want to increase therapeutic index. Okay, so what are flash and phaser? So flash I'm using to refer to as a new way of delivering radiation that it gives all of the radiation dose nearly instantaneously. So several hundred to maybe a few thousand times faster than we currently deliver radiation. And I'll explain why that may be beneficial in just a bit. And then the other kind of sci-fi term I'll use here is phaser, which is a unique technology that at Stanford we've been developing in order to be able to deliver this flash-type treatment clinically in patients. So it's not yet in the clinic, but it's something that we're working towards developing. So why is fast radiation therapy beneficial? And so I'm coming at this at an angle as a lung cancer doc, and this is my dancing lung tumor movie. So what this is a picture of a lung tumor this is a CT scan movie, and it shows a patient breathing, and as you can imagine, as the patient breathes and the lungs move, the tumors move with it. And so one of my tasks is to treat moving targets, to shoot at moving targets, and ensure that I don't miss, and also that I don't hit, the normal tissues that we don't want to hit. And so over time, we've developed and implemented lots of very complicated technologies in the clinic in order to do this better. But with that came the insight over time that, well, maybe if we could address this fundamental assumption that it always takes longer to give the radiation than it does for the tumor to move, maybe we can turn that around and say, well, what if we could develop the technology to give the radiation almost instantaneously? Then all of that motion would be frozen, we'd be able to deliver much more precise therapy, we'd be able to damage a lot less of the surrounding normal organs. But at the same time, as we started working on the technologies to deliver very fast radiation therapy, a number of laboratories, and including our own, started finding some very interesting biological results when we actually tested giving very fast radiation in mice. Turns out that we have the technology to do this in mice. It doesn't actually scale up to humans, so we need new technology to do this in humans. But we can study ultra-fast flash radiation in mice. And this is just one example of work that's been done, and this is actually work of my collaborator, Dr. Aaron Rankin, where we look at irradiation of the abdomen of the mouse, and this is in mice that have ovarian cancer cells spread throughout the abdomen. Oops. And the surprising finding is that if you give a large dose of radiation to the whole abdomen, what you expect to find is that the mice will have intestinal damage, and they'll in fact die because of diarrhea and inability to have normal bowel function. And so this is what you see with a conventional high dose of radiation. This is a survival over time. All the mice die quite quickly within about a week. But if you give the same dose of radiation in this nearly instantaneous fraction of a second type of treatment, same dose for dose, almost all the mice live. And in fact, when we start looking at the microscopic level of the intestinal cells, you can see that these dark cells here are the stem cells in the intestine that when the intestine's damaged, they repopulate and help the animals recover. After the conventional dose of radiation, there's very few of these intestinal crypts left, whereas many more are left if the same dose of radiation is given in a flash. On the other hand, if we look at what happens to the tumors in the abdomens of these animals, we find that without any radiation, these tumors grow kind of unchecked. But whether you give the conventional dose or the flash dose of radiation, there's a substantial reduction in the tumors. So the tumor control is the same when you give the radiation in a flash, but the normal tissues are much less damaged. And so that's achieving this therapeutic index, tumor killing with less collateral damage. And this was a very surprising finding, but it's now been shown in labs around the world in different organ systems, in different tumor types, but of course all in mice and other preclinical models of cancer. So that creates a lot of excitement for us. And so that brings us to the development of this next generation technology. So this is actually the current state of the art. This is an advanced radiation therapy machine that we use at Stanford. This is the current fastest radiation therapy in the world. And in fact, at Stanford, we were the first to implement this style of delivery. So what you're seeing here is a linear accelerator delivering a radiation beam. It's moving around the patient so that all these beams can cross and focus very precisely on the tumor. You can see that it's starting and stopping because it's actually synchronized with the breathing of the patient to get that maximum precision. And it takes about 3 minutes to deliver the entire dose of very high dose ablative radiation therapy to a lung tumor, which is very fast compared to what we were able to do a decade ago. But it's still quite long compared to the motion in the body and this kind of novel biological effect that we're aiming for. Now, the concept that we're trying to develop currently, now don't blink, that's the flash that we want to deliver to patients. This is what we refer to as phaser. It comprises multiple very novel inventions that we've been working on at Stanford and have actually built prototypes of several of these core technologies already. So what we're trying to achieve is radiation that's about 400 times faster than the current fastest treatment for that ultimate precision and motion freezing, taking advantage of hopefully these really new biological effects that we see with flash. But at the same time, and I'll come back to this in a bit, we're focusing very much on developing the technology to be very compact and economical because that's what is needed for it to be a practical therapy that will have relevance to patients around the world. As I mentioned, many innovative inventions have gone into the development of this phaser technology. I'm only going to mention one of them, which is the linear accelerator technology at its core. This is a new generation of linear accelerator technology, and the science underlying it was developed by my colleague, Dr. Sami Tantali at SLAC National Accelerator Lab. So this is a much more efficient linear accelerator. It can take the same amount of power to generate much more radiation beam in a much smaller space. So this is what it takes to generate that 400 times more beam. But the same manufacturing processes that were needed to create the novel shapes that allow this sort of very efficient innovation actually also greatly lowers the manufacturing costs. So we're trying to attack the practicality and the performance at the same time. Now, just kind of an interesting note here, this is an aerial view of the 2-mile-long SLAC linear accelerator. This is Highway 280 running over it right there. And you can see that using this as a yardstick within 2 miles of SLAC is the Stanford Cancer Center. And so that just highlights the synergy that's really kind of unique in the world that we can have around here, where we have the world-class expertise of the Stanford Cancer Institute just down the street from the world-class accelerator expertise of SLAC. Now, coming back to why we're focusing on compactness and economy, as I mentioned, it's been estimated that about half of patients around the world with cancer would benefit from radiation therapy. And in fact, again, because of the advances that you've heard about tonight, I anticipate that an even greater proportion of patients would benefit from radiation. However, at the same time, only about half of patients worldwide who could benefit from radiation have any access at all. And so you can see here sort of all the hot spots where there's a great shortage of radiation, and particularly in Africa, for example, there are many countries where there are populations of millions of people who have no access to radiation therapy at all. So what that means is that as of today, millions of patients around the world who should be able to receive curative treatment can only get palliative treatment. So this is really a global health crisis that's going on right now. So if you want to save millions of lives every year, one way to address that would be for the millions of patients who get radiation therapy every year to make that radiation therapy more effective and more successful at curing the cancer. For those millions of patients who currently are not considered eligible for curative style therapy because of these advances in systemic therapy and immunotherapy, making many more of them eligible for curative treatment. And then the really obvious and immediate thing is for the half of the patients around the world, millions of patients who can't get any radiation therapy because they just have no access, making it accessible. So how can we do that? That compactness and economy comes into play, and we very deliberately designed the technologies of the spacer system to fit within a standard cargo shipping container. And that would actually make it the most compact form factor of any radiation therapy system. Why this form factor? Because millions of these this universal size form factor are shipped around the world every year on ships, on trains, on trucks. And also, this is not actually a totally innovative idea in the sense that many other things have been designed to fit in that sort of form factor for the same reason. For example, solar power and battery storage. So this is a 20 kilowatt solar power generator, enough power to power a phaser system designed to unfold out of a cargo shipping container that can be drop shipped to emergency zones around the world for disaster relief. The same form factor has been used to design unfolding mobile operating rooms. These things exist. That's what it looks like on the inside when it's unfolded. So from the standpoint of cancer therapy, if we can provide mobile cancer surgery, solar battery power, chemotherapy infusion, maybe CT scanning, and a missing factor has been radiation therapy, but with that, then perhaps we could ship a mobile cancer center anywhere around the world in 6 boxes. And so that's the vision of where we want to go with this, is globally accessible curative cancer care. So cancer care that's much better, but also much more accessible to address that global crisis. So I'm just going to conclude by coming back to a little bit of history. As you heard earlier, the first broadly used medical linear accelerator design in the world, and the first one in the Western Hemisphere, was invented at Stanford by Dr. Henry Kaplan, who was the first chair of radiology, and Dr. Edward Ginston, who was a professor of physics. This was the first patient treated on what was called LA1 in 1956, linear accelerator 1, a boy with retinoblastoma, eye cancer, and his cancer was cured, his vision was saved, and he's actually alive today. So this comes to kind of this motto that our current chair of radiology, Sam Gambier, came up with, which is invented at Stanford, used everywhere. As Dr. McDougall mentioned, the CyberKnife, invented by our neurosurgeon John Adler, was also invented here at Stanford. And so what we'd like to see is is within a few years, the first flash radiation therapy system, phaser, to be deployed at Stanford. So a lot of people have contributed to this work. This is just a small part of our team. I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Great job.